Why do some wounds feel sharper when they come from family? I asked myself that question the moment my brother's laugh echoed through the church. The rain hadn't stopped all morning. It fell in that thin Puget Sound drizzle, the kind that doesn't pour but seeps into your coat, your hair, your bones. Queen Anne's Chapel sat on the hill, its stone steps slick with moss, lilies crowding the front pews with their heavy perfume. A funeral should have been about silence, about remembering. But that day it became about humiliation. Caleb Monroe, my brother, was dressed like always, sharp, tailored charcoal suit, cufflinks flashing like he'd been born on Wall Street instead of under the same leaking roof as me. He shook hands, told stories about his real estate deals in Bellevue, laughing at his own jokes while mourners nodded politely. He had that way of bending any room around himself. Even grief bent for him. And then came the colonel, a man who had once served with our father. His eyes carried the weight of service, of loss, of men buried far too early. He approached me quietly, voice softened by the solemn air. "Your father was proud of you." Just 6 words, but they cut through me. For a heartbeat I thought maybe I'd be seen. But then Caleb appeared, sliding his arm heavy across my shoulders like a chain, his voice slick with that practiced smirk. "Don't mind my sister. Her idea of service is fixing staplers." A ripple of laughter spread through the group. The colonel's smile faltered. My chest tightened. That was the moment. Not the casket, not the hymns, not even the polished mahogany box holding our father. It was Caleb's laugh that carved me open. Because it wasn't new. It was an old wound, a lifetime of being the shadow, the one dismissed at the dinner table, the one who never measured up. Invisible, no matter what I carried, no matter what I'd done in silence. I stood there in the chapel, the bells tolling outside, the air heavy with damp wool and perfume. And I smiled, the kind of smile I had mastered after years of being diminished. A mask. A cover. Because the truth was a secret I had carried alone, locked behind sealed files in silent halls. That night, long after the mourners had gone and the house had settled into whispers of grief, my phone lit up. Julia Rios, my attorney. Her voice was calm, deliberate, surgical even. She told me she had received a sealed envelope from the Department of the Air Force. "If Caleb pushes this," she said, "we'll use it. But you need to stay calm. This fight won't be like the ones at the dinner table." I sat there in the dim light, rain tapping steady against the window, the room heavy with loss. And I knew with a cold, absolute certainty, the next battle wasn't going to be about whispers in our family. It was going to be fought in the open, in a courtroom. But the courtroom had no idea what it was about to step into. The lawyer's office smelled of oak and old paper. Pioneer Square had that timeless weight, brick walls pressing in with a history that didn't let you breathe too easily. We gathered around the long wooden table, my mother in her black gloves, hands folded in her lap like the grief was a performance she wouldn't let slip. Caleb lounged in his chair like he was closing another deal. Smirk, cufflinks, polished shoes. He was comfortable here. The lawyer read our father's will, evenly split, property and accounts divided. Caleb's smirk grew wider. He had expected this. He was already picturing his slice, already folding it into his empire. And then came the line, my father's handwriting, uneven but clear. "I wish to acknowledge Verratti's quiet service." The room stilled. Caleb's hand shot out, ripping the page before the lawyer could lower it. He barked a laugh. "Service? What service?" His voice was sharp, rising. His eyes burned into me like I had forged the words myself. "She made this up. She conned him while he was dying. She's nothing but a fraud." My mother sighed heavy, shaking her head. Her eyes didn't soften. They hardened, disappointed. As if my father's last words were an embarrassment to her. As if I had dragged shame into the room. I sat frozen, staring at my father's handwriting. Just one line. One acknowledgement. And yet it felt like a hand on my shoulder, one he hadn't been able to give me when he was alive. A whisper that all those years, all those nights I disappeared into silence, hadn't been for nothing. But Caleb didn't see it as that. To him, it was an insult to his narrative. He slammed the papers back down, his laugh cold. "I'll take this to court," he said. "Let's see how long your little fantasy lasts under oath." And so it began. The week after the petition arrived. A thick packet of papers, bold words across the top, "Stolen valor." My father's final words reduced to an allegation of fraud. The first mediation session was held in a cramped conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed above, buzzing like they were in on the cruelty. Caleb leaned forward, theatrically smoothing his lapel. "Her idea of service," he sneered. "Resetting a modem. She conned our father while he was dying, pretending she was something she's not." I sat still, my hands folded, my face trained to give nothing away. Julia leaned close, whispered, "Let him keep talking. Every word is a gift. Every accusation will hang him." Behind him, my mother nodded, her lips pressed tight, as though each insult was gospel. The room thickened with the same smug certainty I had grown up drowning in. When the session adjourned, Julia and I stepped into the hallway. The air was cold, my breath fogging. She leaned close, her voice deliberate. "We're going to use CIPA, Classified Information Procedures Act. Almost no one outside federal circles knows how it works. If it comes to it, the judge can review your record privately under seal. But we need Caleb to keep digging his own hole. Let him." I looked back through the glass. My brother was laughing with his lawyer, smug, satisfied, as if the verdict was already written. And I thought, "You have no idea. You have no idea what you've just stepped into." That night I lay awake. The rain was still falling outside, tapping like fingers against the glass. My mind wandered back, as it often did, to a locked room humming with servers, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a headset pressing against my ears. "Echo Ridge, stand by for Title 10. The words had echoed in my skull. The screens glowed with cascading green code, shifting like rivers of war you couldn't see. The taste of stale coffee clung to my tongue. My heart pounded as keystrokes became weapons, as every decision carried the weight of lives unseen. That was my battlefield, and no one in that courtroom would ever understand it. But Caleb wasn't slowing down. The headlines started. Local blogs. "Seattle woman fakes military service." His whispers fed reporters, and the words grew louder, spreading like a fire across wet timber. Every time I stepped into the courthouse, cameras turned toward me like a firing line. I held my breath steady, calm, because my father had been right, my service had been quiet, and it wasn't about proving it to them. It was about surviving long enough for the truth to be undeniable. And yet some nights I asked myself, would the truth even matter? Or would Caleb's laughter drown it out again, the way it always had? That was the first act of the war. My brother never thought I could fight. Why did the courtroom feel colder than the rain outside? I wondered that as I crossed the West Seattle Bridge one gray morning, fog draping the bay like a shroud. The courthouse loomed ahead, paneled in stone, its windows slick with mist. My coat carried the faint metallic tang of ozone, the smell that clung to me after long nights under humming servers. No one here would recognize it, but to me, it was the scent of duty. Inside, the air was heavy, yellow lamps buzzing, the musk of damp wood pressed into the walls. Family disputes had been decided here for decades, but this one was different. Caleb stood at the front, suit crisp, smile rehearsed. His lawyer, Victor Lton, a man with too much theater in his voice, rose with authority. "My client asserts Ms. Monroe has never served. There are no discharge papers, no VA card, nothing." His words echoed against the wood-paneled walls. The court reporter's keys clattered, recording the claim as though it were truth. I sat still, hands folded, every line of my body calm. The judge, Meredith Hale, leaned back in her chair, eyes half-lidded, her expression betraying little more than boredom. Another family squabble wasting her docket. But inside me, another room was stirring. The courtroom dissolved and I was back in the server bay. Screens glowing green with cascading code, the headset pressing tight against my ears. The clipped voice over the comms, Echo Ridge, standby for Title 10. My pulse thrummed. A keystroke could stop a cyberattack from tearing through Washington's water systems. A wrong keystroke could drown a city. That was my service, invisible, unspoken, and Caleb had no idea. A vibration jolted me back to the courtroom. My phone pulsed once, discreet. I glanced down, shielding it from view, an encrypted text. Local blog just posted. Seattle woman fakes military service. Source points to family. My chest tightened. Caleb had gone public. I lifted my eyes toward him. He met my gaze with a grin, smug, almost triumphant. He thought the smear campaign would end me before the court ever had to decide. Reporters whispered in the back row, pens ready. Under my breath, I murmured words only I could hear. You have no idea what you've stepped into. By the second day, the courtroom was fuller. Not just family anymore. Reporters had slipped in, their notepads poised, their cameras hidden under coats until they were brave enough to raise them. The whispers were louder now. Stolen valor in Seattle. Caleb sat taller, his chin lifted. Every headline validated him. He wasn't just a brother fighting an inheritance anymore. He was a man exposing a fraud. At least, that's how he saw himself. Victor strode forward, voice booming, brandishing a paper. We submit additional evidence, a letter from the VA stating Ms. Monroe never served. The words hit the room like a gavel. He handed the page to the judge with the flourish of a showman. Judge Hale flipped it open, brows barely moving. Beside me, Julia leaned in, her voice sharp but quiet. The font's wrong, the stamp is blurred, that letter screams forgery. I didn't speak, didn't blink. Across the aisle, Caleb leaned back, stretching like a man already victorious. His mother, my mother too, though in that moment she didn't feel like mine, allowed herself a faint smile. Vindication, she thought. Proof that her daughter had never been what her son was. Julia pressed her hand against mine, grounding me. Her whisper steady, "Don't worry. DOJ already sent us the sealed envelope. When the moment comes, only the judge will see it. That's the ace." I held my breath as the clerk bent to whisper into Judge Hale's ear. His words carried just enough for Julia and me to catch. The VA denial letter showed signs of falsification. Forgery. This wasn't just a probate fight anymore. It was slipping toward something darker, toward crime. But Victor pressed on, milking his theater. "Additionally," he said, "the will contains a sealed letter from the late Mr. Monroe addressed directly to this court." All eyes turned toward it. A dark green envelope, resting untouched in the evidence folder. The rain streaked the courthouse windows. Its rhythm was relentless, steady, like my resolve. If Caleb wanted to drag me into the light, then I would let the light burn him. By the third morning, the rain sharpened into needles, stinging my face as I crossed the courthouse steps. Cameras tilted toward me, shutters clicking like gunfire. I didn't flinch. The wind slapped my cheeks clean, almost liberating. Inside, Victor pounced the moment the judge entered. "Justice must be public. There's no basis for a closed proceeding." Julia rose. Her voice was even, deliberate. "We submit classified evidence under the authority of CIPA. Only the court may review it. It will not enter the public record." The room stiffened. Caleb folded his arms, smirk curling at the corner. "If it's real, why hide it?" Judge Hale frowned as the bailiff handed her a sealed envelope. The wax was stamped in red. She turned it over in her hands. Irritation flickered across her face until her eyes landed on the header. Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Her posture changed, snapped upright. Her palms settled over the seal as if shielding it from the rest of the room. One reporter tried to rise for a photo. The bailiff barked him down, snatching the camera. The room fell into a hush. Julia leaned close, whispering so only I could hear. If she opens it at the bench, Caleb has no off-ramp. I glanced at him. He was still grinning. He didn't realize the blade was already unsheathed. The judge called Caleb to the stand. Rain tapped against the windows, a slow metronome to his arrogance. He lifted his chin, voice smooth. My sister never served. She manipulated our father for money. This is stolen valor. His words hung like smoke. I drew a slow breath, held it, released it. Julia stood, calm, unshaken. Your Honor, we moved to open the sealed envelope. Judge Hale cracked the wax. She scanned the page, and then the color drained from her face. Her glasses slipped down her nose. Her voice, when it came, was hard, cold. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. We proceed in camera under seal. The oak doors boomed shut, the reporters silenced, the whispers cut off mid-breath. It was just us now, the judge, the attorneys, my family, and the truth that had been buried for years. The second sealed letter was opened. My father's handwriting, tremored but steady, spilled into the room. He wrote of the nights I had been called away, of the tired eyes I brought home, of the quiet, invisible service no one else in the family had ever understood. The clerk leaned in, confirming what we already knew. The so-called VA denial was a forgery. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about a federal crime. Judge Hale turned her gaze to my brother, her voice cut like ice. Mr. Monroe, your sworn allegations trespass into a national security matter. U.S. Marshals will take your statement. Sweat beaded at his hairline. He shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering. His eyes found mine, desperate, searching for a bridge back to the sister who had always absorbed the humiliation, who had kept the peace. But I let him see there was no bridge, not this time. The marshals stepped forward, silent, efficient. They didn't need to raise their voices. Authority radiated from their presence alone. One gestured, "Sir, you'll need to come with us." Caleb's lips trembled. His gaze darted back to me, wide, pleading. For years he had laughed while I stayed silent. For years I had played the role of the shadow. Now he wanted me to save him. I met his eyes, steady, unblinking, and gave the smallest shake of my head. No, not this time. Outside, the wind slapped my face as I stepped into the open air. Behind me, marshals guided Caleb into the back of a black, unmarked car. The door shut with a thud. And just like that, the era of his unchecked power ended. Not by me, but by the very system he thought he could manipulate. The cameras outside never saw the truth. They only saw the car pulling away, the storm gathering, the whispers swelling. But inside me, there was silence. A silence I hadn't felt in years. Because sometimes, the loudest victory is the one carried in quiet. What happens when the silence in a room feels heavier than the noise that came before it? That was the question burning in me as the oak doors shut behind the reporters, leaving only family, counsel, and the judge. The air inside chambers was thick, charged, as though even the rain pressing against the windows knew what had just shifted. Judge Meredith Hale adjusted her glasses, her voice clipped, deliberate. The will stands as valid. The estate is to be divided equally. There are no grounds for contest. Her words landed with the weight of a final gavel strike, a line carved into stone. Caleb's allegations, his smirking confidence, his forged evidence shattered in that instant. But the victory didn't feel sweet. It felt hollow. The letter my father had written, his shaky script acknowledging my service, had been slipped into the folder, preserved as part of the record. I watched the clerk slide it away like an artifact. It was both everything and nothing. One sentence. One man's attempt to say he saw me before he left. Julia leaned close, her voice meant for me alone. The real victory isn't the money. You've reclaimed your story. I nodded, but her words couldn't touch the part of me that felt raw and bare. Across the room, my mother sat stiff, hands folded over her black gloves. Her lips trembled, not with sympathy but with something harder to name, disappointment perhaps, or shame. She hadn't looked at me when the truth surfaced. She hadn't reached for me when Caleb's smirk collapsed into sweat and fear. She had just sat there, hollow, as though everything confirmed what she had always believed. I was still a disruption, still an embarrassment. The silence around her spoke louder than the judge's ruling. For years I had thought maybe she just didn't understand me, that maybe my service was invisible to her because she couldn't picture it. But in that silence, I realized it wasn't about understanding. It was about choice. She had chosen her narrative, and it didn't include me. That truth cut deeper than Caleb's lies ever had. Outside, the press waited like wolves, cameras snapping, questions hurled. "Ms. Monroe, did you lie about your service? Is it true you forged evidence? What was in the sealed letter?" I walked past them, my face calm, my silence steady. The marshals guided Caleb into a black, unmarked car, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. The door slammed shut, and just like that, his empire of mockery collapsed. But no camera caught the real story. They didn't see what had happened behind those sealed doors. They didn't see my father's handwriting. They didn't hear the word service whispered in acknowledgement, a word that had lived in shadows for so long. And I didn't intend to tell them. Because service isn't about applause. It never has been. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city outside blurred by rain on glass. My hands curled around a mug of coffee gone cold. The weight of the day pressed heavy on my shoulders. Vindicated in court. Branded in public. That was the paradox of a life lived in classified shadows. The truth existed, but it couldn't be spoken. Not to my family, not to reporters, not even to the people who wanted to believe me. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes closing, and the hum of the servers returned. The glow of green code cascaded across the darkness in my mind. I was back there, back in that locked room, headset pressed against my ear, coffee cooling on a desk I never left. "Echo Ridge, stand by for Title 10. The voice had been calm, clipped, unshaken. My pulse had hammered as I typed, keystrokes clicking like rifle fire. Each one mattered. A single mistake could mean lives lost. Most people think service is measured in battles fought with bullets. But mine was measured in sleepless nights, in lines of code, in the quiet moments when no one knew an attack had been stopped before it reached their water, their power, their hospitals. That was my battlefield. And no one at that funeral, no one in that courtroom, not even my mother, would ever truly know. The weeks after the trial blurred into a strange kind of limbo. Caleb's name flickered in headlines, whispers of forgery, federal review, possible indictment. The press that had once painted me as a liar now turned their ink toward him. But they never corrected the story about me. The smear had done its work. To the public, I was still a shadow. At work, I carried on, logging in, securing networks, running silent drills with the same steady hands that had guided me through crises most Americans never knew existed. But something inside me shifted. Every time I sat down at the console, I felt the echo of my father's handwriting. Quiet service. A phrase so simple, but it wrapped around me like armor. Still, the emptiness lingered. One evening, Julia called. Her tone was softer than usual. "You did well, Verades. I've seen clients crumble under less, but I need to ask, are you okay?" For a long time, I didn't answer. The silence stretched between us until I finally spoke. "It doesn't feel like winning, not really." "Because you wanted something else," she said. "Something your family can't give." Her words stung, but they were true. Weeks turned into months. Caleb's name eventually faded from the headlines, drowned out by fresher scandals, newer crimes. But my mother's silence didn't fade. Not a word, not a call, not even a message. Until one afternoon, as I sat in my apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with her name. For a moment, my breath caught. A small, fragile hope stirred in me. Maybe this was the moment she would finally see me. I opened the message. Caleb is in trouble. Please help your brother. Nothing else. No acknowledgement, no apology, not even my name. I read it twice. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. Instead, a calm spread through me, a clarity I hadn't known before. And then I blocked the number. The weight lifted instantly. For the first time in my life, I realized the chains weren't hers to hold anymore. At Camp Murray, months later, I stood in a modest conference room, my Air National Guard uniform pressed and straight. The flag hung quietly on the wall. Sunlight spilled warm across rows of chairs. The commander pinned a citation to my chest. His words were measured, steady, for quiet and dedicated service in defense of national infrastructure. There was no applause, no cameras, no headlines, only handshakes, nods, the kind of recognition that doesn't need noise to be real. My mind drifted back to all the nights I had given, nights no one would ever know about. The bitter taste of cold coffee, the hum of servers, the glow of screens, the silence that carried the weight of unseen battles. That was my legacy, not the estate, not the courtroom, not the headlines, but the quiet. Later that evening, I stood by Elliott Bay. The ferry slipped into the dark, its horn rolling across the water, low and haunting. The city lights shimmered against the waves, distorted by the rain still falling soft and steady. I thought of Caleb, of my mother, of the judge's gavel, of my father's handwriting, and I knew then what I hadn't before. True legacy isn't carved into property lines. It isn't signed in ink on legal documents. It lives in the silence of service, in the respect of those who know what it costs to stand guard in the shadows. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not victory, not triumph. Peace. Why do memories return at the quietest hours? That question haunted me weeks after the courtroom doors had closed, after the marshals had led Caleb away, after the reporters had moved on to fresher scandals. I would wake in the middle of the night, the city outside blurred by mist, and for a moment I'd think I was back there, back in the sealed server room, the hum of machines my only companion, the air sharp with the bite of ozone. Sleep didn't bring rest. It brought echoes. Echoes of commands. Echoes of code. Echoes of nights when the world hung by a thread and no one ever knew. Seattle moved on quickly. That's the way cities work. Yesterday's scandal becomes today's footnote, but I carried the silence like a stone in my chest. Every coffee shop I walked into, I could feel eyes linger a second too long, searching for the woman from those headlines. Was she the fraud, or the one who got away with it? They never said it aloud. They didn't need to. I answered their stares with calm silence, outwardly steady, inwardly fractured. Because what haunted me wasn't their doubt. It was the truth they could never know. One evening, Julia called again. Her tone was different now, lighter, almost proud. Charges are moving forward against Caleb, forgery, perjury. It's out of your hands now. I thanked her, but my voice was flat. It wasn't justice I was thinking about. It was the memory of my brother's eyes, wide with fear as the marshals closed in. For years he had mocked me, diminished me, and in that final moment he had looked to me to save him. And I hadn't. Part of me still replayed that look in the dark, not out of guilt, but because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. Even my brother had known. Deep down, he had always known I was stronger. He just couldn't let himself say it. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the window, watching the lights flicker across Elliott Bay. And without meaning to, I was back there again. Back on the mission that had nearly broken me. It had been winter, snow piling against the walls of a base I still can't name. My uniform smelled of diesel, sweat, and the bitter tang of cold coffee. We had been briefed quickly, the kind of briefing where the details were sparse and the stakes unspoken. Just one phrase. Critical infrastructure, ongoing attack, all hands. The room had filled with the hum of servers as we slid into our stations, headsets clamped down, screens alive with data. I remember the commander's voice clipped and tense. They're in the grid, water systems first, electricity next. My heart had pounded so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. My hands hovered over the keyboard, every nerve screaming. The chatter in my ear was relentless: coordinates, firewall breaches, intrusion attempts. It felt like drowning in numbers. And then came the moment, the one I still see when I close my eyes. A breach warning, cascading red lines across the screen. If I failed to shut it down, thousands would lose access to clean water within hours. Hospitals, families, entire cities. I froze for half a second, just 1/2 second, my fingers trembling above the keys. That was the moment the weight of it hit me, not as a soldier, not as a specialist, but as a human being. Because failure wasn't just numbers, it was lives, children, people I'd never meet. And then, like a reflex, training took over. My fingers slammed against the keys, commands firing like bullets, patches layered over breaches. I didn't breathe until the lines turned green again. The room had gone silent, just the hum of machines, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. No one clapped, no one even spoke. They just nodded once quietly, and the work went on. That was my service. Back in the present, I set the glass down and leaned my head against the cold pane of glass. The city lights blurred with rain, and I thought about how easily Caleb had mocked it. Fixing staplers, that's what he called it. He would never know the nights I had lived through. The nights where silence wasn't peace but tension, where one mistake meant a city's collapse. And the worst part, I couldn't tell him, not even if I wanted to. Because my service wasn't mine to share. It belonged to the classified halls, the sealed envelopes, the quiet acknowledgments from commanders who would never speak my name outside the base. That was the bargain I had made when I signed the papers. Service in silence. Weeks later, Julia and I met in her office again. The same oak table, the same heavy shelves of law books. She poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to me. "You've done everything right," she said. "Now you need to let yourself breathe." But I shook my head. Breathing didn't feel earned yet. Because I knew something Julia didn't. Something the courtroom didn't. Something even Caleb, for all his cruelty, could never imagine. That mission I remembered, the one where the water systems almost collapsed, it wasn't the worst. It wasn't even close. The worst was the one I never wanted to remember. The one that had left me staring at a screen, the glow burning into my eyes as I realized we had been too late. I don't talk about that night, not to Julia, not to anyone. But it visits me when the city is quiet, when the rain taps steady on glass, when the silence grows too thick. It was a hospital system. Somewhere across the country. The details don't matter. What matters is that we weren't fast enough. The breach slipped through, silent and merciless. Power cut. Monitors darkened. Machines failed. I can still hear the clipped voice in my headset reporting what we didn't want to hear. Patients lost. Not numbers. People. I sat frozen, my fingers useless on the keyboard, my body locked in place. The glow of the screen lit the tears I hadn't even realized were falling. That was the night I learned the truth about service in silence. You don't always save them. Sometimes you just carry the weight of not being fast enough. The courtroom would never know that. Caleb would never know that. My mother would never know that. And maybe that was the point. Some legacies aren't carved into stone or shouted into headlines. Some legacies are scars carried alone, hidden behind pressed uniforms and steady salutes. That night, standing at the window overlooking Elliott Bay, I pressed my palm flat against the glass, and I whispered to the reflection staring back at me. "You did what you could. That has to be enough." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. The following week, Julia called with an update. Caleb's indictment was moving forward. Federal charges. He was spiraling. "Do you want to be present for the hearing?" she asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to see him stripped of the arrogance he had worn like armor, but another part of me was tired. Tired of battles, tired of family wounds, tired of courtrooms and cameras and the endless cycle of proving myself. "No," I finally said, "I don't need to watch." Because in the end, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, and the silent wars I had already fought. That night the city slept under another blanket of rain. I sat alone, the hum of memory buzzing in my ears, the servers, the commands, the failures, the quiet nods of recognition that never left the room. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel something other than shame or anger or exhaustion. I allowed myself to feel pride. Not the loud kind, not the kind Caleb craved with his sales deals and his tailored suits, but the quiet kind, the kind that lives in scars, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken, the kind my father saw when he wrote that single line in his will. I wish to acknowledge Varadi's quiet service. And for the first time, I realized maybe that was enough. Why does vindication sometimes feel lonelier than accusation? That thought hit me weeks after the sealed courtroom ruling. The papers had written their stories, the marshals had taken Caleb away, and the reporters had moved on. Yet when I walked through Seattle's streets, I still felt their eyes. At the grocery store, someone lingered near the produce aisle too long. At the coffee shop, a man glanced over the top of his newspaper just a beat too slow. They weren't looking at me as Varadi's Monroe, a woman who had quietly served her country. They were looking at me as her, the woman accused of faking, the sister dragged through a public courtroom brawl, vindicated on paper but guilty in whispers. Vindication is quiet, shame echoes. One evening my phone buzzed, unknown number. For reasons I can't explain, I answered. Varadi's, the voice was soft, tentative, my mother. I gripped the phone tighter. The silence on my end stretched long enough that she began to fill it. I didn't know about your service. You never told me." Her words cracked something in me, but not the way she thought, because they weren't apology. They weren't even acknowledgement. They were blame wrapped in ignorance. "You never told me." As if it had been my choice to stay silent. As if the rules of classification were a childish stubbornness. I swallowed, my throat raw. It wasn't something I could tell. Another pause, then sharper. "Your brother's life is ruined. He says you could still help." There it was, not pride, not understanding, not love, a request, a demand. Caleb's shadow cast even here. I closed my eyes, listening to the rain tap the window, steady and cold. "No," I whispered. The silence on her end was heavy, then she hung up. I set the phone down. My hand trembled, but not from fear, from finality. The door had closed. That night the dreams returned. Not the courtroom, not my father's letter, the mission, the one that never leaves. It had been spring, the kind of spring where rain turns to ice at night. We had been pulled from our bunks without warning, hustled down cold corridors into the server bay. Screens flickered alive, headsets distributed. The commander's voice cut through. "They've breached air traffic, multiple hubs. If we don't stop it, planes go down." The air had turned thick. My pulse hammered. Fingers hovered over keys as the chatter filled my ears, breaches, firewall collapses, intrusion vectors. And then the screen lit with a cascading series of red alerts. One of them glared brighter than the rest. A hub I knew too well. SeaTac, my home. My breath froze, my family, my friends. Everyone I'd ever known could be on those planes. I hesitated, just a second, maybe two, it was enough. The breach expanded, reaching deeper, faster. My hands shook as I slammed commands into the system, redirecting, isolating, rerouting code. Sweat blurred my vision, tears mixing in. I muttered under my breath, a prayer, a curse, I don't remember. And then green, The lines turned green. The room exhaled as one. Lives saved, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking, because in that moment of hesitation, I had seen them all falling. That was my service. Not medals, not parades, just silence, just weight, just nightmares. I woke gasping, sweat slick on my skin, rain still tapping steady against the glass. I sat on the edge of the bed, face buried in my hands, whispering to myself, "You did it. You stopped it. You did it." But my body didn't believe the words. The next morning, Julia called. "Reporters are circling again. The indictment against Caleb has stirred the pot. They'll want a quote from you." "No," I said flatly. "Varades, this is your chance to tell your side, to reclaim your narrative publicly." I almost laughed. Publicly. As if my service had ever belonged to the public. As if the secrets sealed in that judge's hands could suddenly be spilled for headlines. "I don't owe them anything," I said. Julia sighed. "I just don't want you to disappear in their version of the story." But disappearing had always been my role, the invisible one, the quiet one, the one whose service left no trail. Later that day, walking through Pioneer Square, I passed by two reporters huddled with coffee cups, their voices low but urgent. I caught a fragment. "She's untouchable now. National security seal. That's bigger than a discharge paper." They looked up, their eyes snagging on me. One raised a phone like a weapon. I turned away, my pace steady, heart pounding. Untouchable. The word sounded nothing like freedom. It sounded like exile. That night I went back to the base. My uniform pressed, my boots silent against the hallway floor. The server bay smelled the same, ozone, dust, and old coffee. The machines hummed steady, familiar. I sat down at the console, headset snug, fingers hovering over the keys. The mission was routine, a drill. But as the code scrolled past, my mind drifted. To my mother's silence. To Caleb's smirk. To the judge's face draining of color as she read that sealed letter. And then to the green lines turning red. To the planes that almost fell. To the hospital monitors that had gone dark. To the people we hadn't been able to save. My fingers trembled just slightly, but enough. A hand settled on my shoulder, the commander's voice low, steady. "You're still here. That matters more than you know." I blinked, the screen snapping back into focus. My breathing slowed, and I realized something in that moment. Service isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. Again and again, even when the weight feels unbearable. Later, standing outside, the rain washed across the base parking lot, slicking the pavement into silver. I tilted my head back, letting the cold drops sting my skin. I thought of my father, his handwriting, his acknowledgement, quiet service. And for the first time in months, I let myself believe him. Maybe it didn't matter if the world doubted. Maybe it didn't matter if my mother never spoke my name with pride. Maybe it didn't matter if Caleb's shadow had loomed over me for decades. Because I knew. The commander knew. And somewhere in sealed files and quiet letters, my father had known. That had to be enough. But even as I stood there in the rain, peace slipping across me like a fragile film, I couldn't shake the question that lingered, pressing at the edges of my mind. How many more battles would I have to fight in silence before the weight finally broke me? Why does silence grow heavier when the war is already over? That question haunted me long after the courtroom had closed its doors. Caleb was gone, swallowed into the federal system. The will was settled, the estate divided. On paper I had won, but victory never felt like this. It felt like walking through an empty house after the lights had gone out. The city moved on. Headlines turned to other scandals. But inside me the fight kept replaying. Not against Caleb, not against Victor and his forged letters. Against myself. Against the weight of a service no one was allowed to understand. I tried to live quietly again. Work, home, sleep, repeat, but the cracks widened. At the grocery store, I froze in the aisle when the hum of a refrigerator fan sounded like the buzz of fluorescent lights from the server bay. At night, I woke to the phantom clatter of keys, my heart pounding as if the mission alarm had just sounded. The past wasn't staying buried, it was bleeding into everything. One evening, unable to sit still, I drove through the city, rain streaking across my windshield, wipers thudding steady. I ended up in front of my mother's house without meaning to. The porch light was on, warm against the dark drizzle. For a long time I just sat there, the engine idling, the memories pressing in. I thought about knocking, about asking her one more time if she could see me, if she could believe me, if she could love me without condition. But then I remembered her voice on the phone. "Your brother's life is ruined. He says you could still help." Not pride, not understanding, not love, just another demand. I turned the engine off, sat in the dark, and whispered to myself, no, not anymore. Then I drove away. Back at my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window, watching the fairy lights glide across Elliott Bay. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed, tired. And suddenly, I was back there again. Not SeaTac, not the hospital, another mission, the one that nearly split me in half. It had been late, past midnight. I was at my console, headset snug, the servers humming like restless bees. The command came in clipped tones. Critical breach, defense contractor network, classified files at risk. I remember the heat rising in my chest as I dove into the code. Fingers moving fast, commands flooding the screen. But the breach wasn't simple. It was layered, intricate, designed to lure us in and bury us under false leads. My pulse raced. Then I saw it. Hidden in the cascade, a line of code that wasn't just an intrusion. It was extraction, names, addresses, families. Not just soldiers, their children, their spouses. My breath caught. If I failed, if we didn't shut it down, it wouldn't be data lost. It would be lives, the kind who never sign up for the fight but carry its burden anyway. My hands shook, my vision blurred, and for the first time the question slammed into me like a weight I couldn't push aside. Am I enough for this? The code scrolled faster, eating through walls I thought were secure. My fingers stumbled. A single command mistyped. The system screamed red. I froze, heart crashing against my ribs. And then a hand pressed my shoulder. A teammate, his voice low, steady. "Focus, you've got this." I blinked, my breath steadied. Fingers flew again, faster now, surer. The red slowed, shifted, faded to green. We had stopped it. But the image of those names, of children and spouses hanging in the balance, burned into me. Even as the others nodded silently, even as the commander's quiet voice said, "Well done," I knew the truth. I hadn't beaten the breach, I had barely outrun it. And the fear that one day I wouldn't, that one day the names would slip past me, settled deep in my bones. I came back to myself at the window, rain streaking down the glass. My reflection trembled. That was the cost Caleb would never understand. That was the scar my mother would never see. Not medals, not recognition, just nights like this. Nights where the weight never left. The next morning, Julia called again. "You should know the press is circling. They want your comment on Caleb's indictment." "No," I said quickly. "Varades, this is your chance to." I said no. My voice cracked sharper than I intended. She went quiet, then softer. "You can't carry all of this inside forever." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that carrying it was my duty, my oath, my service. But the words caught in my throat, because maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe the silence was what was breaking me. Later that week at the base, I walked into the server bay for another drill. The hum of the machines felt louder than usual, pressing against my skull. I slid into the chair, headset in place, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The exercise began, a simulated breach, but as the red lines filled the screen, my chest tightened, my breath caught, my hands wouldn't move. The commander's voice came through, calm but firm. "Monroe status." I couldn't answer, my throat closed, my vision blurred with tears. The screen swam in front of me, the letters turning into ghosts of names I couldn't save. For the first time, I tore the headset off. The room stilled. My teammates turned, their faces unreadable. I stood, my knees shaking, and walked out. Outside, the rain hit hard, plastering my uniform to my skin. I leaned against the wall, gasping, the storm inside louder than the storm around me. And in that moment, the thought I had buried for years rose like a scream. I can't keep carrying this alone. That night back at my apartment, I sat in the dark with only the sound of rain. My phone glowed in my hand. I scrolled to Julia's name, to the commander, to numbers I never dared call. And I thought about what it would mean to finally say it out loud. Not to the world, not to the reporters, not even to my mother, but to someone who could look me in the eye and say, "I see you." I didn't make the call that night. The silence won again. But the decision had shifted inside me, subtle, fragile, undeniable. Because for the first time, I admitted what I had never let myself say before. Service had made me strong, but silence was breaking me. And if I wanted to survive, truly survive, I would have to learn how to let someone else carry the weight with me. Why is it easier to fight a war in silence than to ask for help in peace? That question gnawed at me in the weeks after I'd walked out of the server bay, headset abandoned on the desk, rain soaking through my uniform outside the base. I told no one what happened, not Julia, not my commander, not anyone, but the tremor in my hands lingered, the panic that had silenced me replaying in my chest like a second heartbeat. For years, I had been the one they could rely on, steady, calm, invisible in my efficiency. And now I felt like a fracture waiting to spread. One evening, unable to bear the silence of my apartment, I drove again. Not to my mother's house this time. I knew that road was closed. Instead, I ended up at Julia's office. The lights were still on, her silhouette bent over papers. She looked up when I knocked. Her eyes softened when she saw my face. "Varades," she said, "come in." For a long moment, I just stood there, my throat tight, my hands trembling in the doorway. And then the words slipped out, quiet, fragile. "I can't do this alone anymore." She didn't ask me to explain. She didn't need to. She just motioned to the chair across from her, poured 2 glasses of water, and waited. It took me a long time to speak. When I did, the words felt jagged, raw. I told her about the server bay, about the nights of code and coffee, about the near misses and the failures, about the names that had haunted me from the mission files. Her eyes never left mine. She didn't flinch, she didn't pity me, she just listened. When I finally fell silent, breathless from the weight of saying it aloud, she leaned forward. Her voice was soft but steady. "Varades' silence kept you alive, but now it's killing you. You've carried too much alone." Tears I didn't know I'd been holding slipped down my cheeks, and for the first time in years, I let them. The next week I met with the base counselor. It wasn't easy. Walking through that door felt harder than any courtroom, harder than any mission, but I did it. She asked me questions I wasn't ready for. When did the panic start? What do you see when you close your eyes? What do you feel when you think about going back? At first I answered mechanically, like a soldier filling out a report, but little by little the armor cracked. I told her about the hospital system, about the patients we hadn't saved, about the night SeaTac almost collapsed under my hands, about my father's letter, about my brother's laughter, about my mother's silence. She listened. Sometimes she wrote notes. Sometimes she just let me speak until the room blurred and my throat burned. And for the first time I realized, speaking the truth out loud didn't make it weaker. It made it bearable. But healing is never clean. It's jagged, uneven. There were days when I left her office lighter, my chest easier. And there were days when I left shaking, as if I'd torn open wounds that had never truly closed. One night after a session that had left me raw, I walked along Elliott Bay, the wind cutting sharp, the water restless with waves. I stopped at the railing, staring at the dark. And I asked myself, was my service worth it? The question chilled me more than the wind, because for years I had never doubted. Even when the weight broke me, I had believed in the purpose. But now, after Caleb, after my mother, after the silence, doubt seeped in. What if my service had meant nothing? What if it had been invisible for a reason? I gripped the railing tighter, knuckles white. The ferry horn echoed across the bay, low and mournful, and in that sound something shifted. I thought of the planes that didn't fall, the water systems that didn't collapse, the names that never made the news because we had stopped the breach in time. No one would ever know those victories, but they were real. And maybe that was enough. Weeks later, I returned to the server bay for the first time since the panic. My hands trembled as I slid the headset into place, the hum of the machines pressing around me. My teammates glanced over, their faces unreadable, but no one spoke. The drill began. Code flooded the screen, red flashing urgent. My pulse quickened, breath shallow. For a moment, the panic threatened to rise again. But then I heard Julia's voice in my mind. Silence kept you alive, but now it's killing you. I closed my eyes, inhaled, exhaled, and reminded myself I wasn't alone anymore. When I opened my eyes, the code was still red, still urgent, but my fingers moved anyway, hesitant at first, then steadier, commands firing, lines shifting, red turning green. The drill ended, the room exhaled, and I realized I was breathing steady too. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't perfection, but it was a start. That night I sat in my apartment with a journal open on the table. Blank pages stared back at me. I picked up a pen and began to write. Not reports, not classified notes, just memories. The colonel at the funeral. Caleb's smirk. My father's handwriting. The hospital. Sitak. The children's names in the code. The words spilled out messy, uneven, but they were mine. For the first time, I wasn't just carrying them, I was letting them breathe. And in that act, I felt something small but undeniable: hope. The following weekend, I stood at the pier, watching the ferry glide across the bay. Families clustered on the deck, laughter carried across the water. The sound stung and soothed at the same time. I thought of Caleb, his smirk gone, his empire shattered. I thought of my mother, her silence still louder than any words. I thought of my father, his shaky script that had started this storm. And I realized something. Legacy isn't about property. It isn't about who wins in court. It isn't even about who gets remembered in headlines. Legacy is about whether you can stand in the rain, battered, broken, and still whisper to yourself, I showed up. I did what I could. And maybe that was the only kind of victory that mattered. As the ferry disappeared into the dark, I felt the weight in my chest loosen. Not gone, not erased, but lighter. Because I had finally taken the first step. And sometimes, the first step is the hardest war of all. Why is the end never as final as we think it will be? That question echoed through me in the months after Caleb's indictment, after the courtroom had emptied, after the sealed letters had been tucked away in archives where no one but a handful of officials would ever see them again. On paper it was done, the will settled, the estate divided, the brother discredited, the accusations dismantled. But life doesn't end in paper victories. It continues, quietly, slowly, like rain sliding down a window, reshaping itself with every drop. My days at the base grew steadier. I returned to the server bay not with the illusion of perfection but with the acceptance of imperfection. Some drills went well, others faltered, but each time I stayed, each time I tried, and that became its own kind of triumph. The commander nodded more often now. My teammates, silent, steady people like me, offered small gestures of respect, a hand on the shoulder, a nod across the room. No applause, no fanfare, just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that means more than medals ever could. At home, the journal filled slowly. Some nights I wrote entire pages, other nights only a single sentence, but every word was a release, every sentence a reminder that I wasn't carrying it all in silence anymore. And slowly, I began to feel human again. One afternoon, I received a message, not from Julia, not from the commander, from someone I hadn't heard from in years. It was my mother. The message was brief. I don't know what to say, but I saw the ceremony. You looked strong. Your father would have been proud. I read it 3 times. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. It just settled. It wasn't the apology I once dreamed of. It wasn't the embrace I once longed for, but it was something, a fragment, a crack in her silence. And for the first time, I didn't need more. Because I had stopped waiting for her recognition to define me. That evening, I returned to the pier by Elliott Bay. The sun dipped low, casting the water in copper light. The ferry glided past, its horn rolling across the waves like a call and an answer. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the salt air, and I thought of everything that had led here. The colonel at the funeral, Caleb's laughter, the forged letter, the courtroom sealed in silence, the marshals guiding him away, my father's handwriting, the hospital breach, the SeaTac near disaster, the names in the code, the panic, the tears, the journal. All of it. It didn't add up to triumph. It didn't add up to failure. It simply added up to me. Verades Monroe, a woman who had served in silence, a woman who had carried weight no one else would ever see, a woman who had broken and then stood back up. And in that moment, I realized something I had never dared to believe before. That was enough. Later, walking back along the waterfront, I passed families laughing, couples holding hands, children chasing seagulls. None of them knew the battles I had fought. None of them knew how close their lives had come to unraveling in unseen ways. And that was the point. Service isn't about being remembered. It isn't about applause or headlines or legacies carved in stone. It's about showing up. It's about carrying the weight when no one else can. It's about standing watch in the dark so others can laugh in the light. In the weeks that followed, I began speaking quietly with others at the base. Not in briefings, not in formal settings, just in hallways, in quiet corners, in the shared silence after a long shift. And I realized I wasn't alone. Others carried their own invisible scars. Others had their own nights of doubt, their own ghosts from missions no one would ever hear about. And when we shared even fragments, the weight grew lighter. Not erased, never erased, but lighter. Months later, I sat in another modest room, sunlight spilling across simple chairs. Another small ceremony, another citation, words spoken about dedication, resilience, perseverance. I stood still, the metal pinned to my chest, the weight both heavy and feather-light. I thought of my father again, his handwriting, his final words, quiet service. And I smiled, not the mask I had worn at funerals, not the tight smile I had given Caleb and his smug friends. A real smile, small, steady, honest. Because I finally believed it. That night I walked home through the drizzle, the city lights blurring against wet pavement. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't check it. For once, I didn't need to. I paused at the waterfront, watching the ferry glide into the dark. Its lights shimmered across the water, fractured but beautiful. And I thought of Caleb, of my mother, of the courtroom, of every night I had spent fighting invisible wars. And I whispered to the rain, a truth that had taken me years to find. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The ferry's horn echoed, the rain fell steady, and for the first time in my life the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like peace.